So if you've watched my channel for an extended period of time, you know that I like to throw out the term filthy casual a lot when referring to certain fans, and I don't think I've taken the time to actually define who I'm talking about. If you've watched my channel, you've probably pieced together the kinds of people I'm talking about, but I wanted to give the absolute clear definition just in case. So if I had to describe what I mean from the best of my ability, a filthy casual, in regards to Star Wars specifically, is a fan who has an extremely limited range, and is prone to thinking about only the shit they've seen when it comes to Star Wars, and they're not even close to reaching the 1% completion rate on all things Star Wars. While I say the term filthy casual, I believe the original term is normie, which basically means the same thing. I say filthy casual because I think it's funnier than the actual common name. Typically, filthy casuals at best have seen all the Star Wars movies, most, if not all the Disney Plus shows plus the Clone Wars and Rebels, and maybe played the video games from the year 2000 onwards. But if we're being real, the oldest one most of them have played is probably LEGO Star Wars The Complete Saga, or The Force Unleashed, or something in the PlayStation 3/Xbox 360 generation of consoles, which is a little after the golden age of Star Wars games. If they read any book, it was a long time ago, and they can't remember anything about it. It was probably a book they took home from the school library for a reading assignment, and when they were done, they put it back and never thought about it again. Traits that filthy casuals have is that they're both incredibly ignorant and don't do any research outside of their range. And they also might exhibit an insane amount of confidence that they know what they're talking about, even if they're not even at the 1% mark. Because yes, sorry to break it to you, but the main series is but a small piece of all the Star Wars content. Filthy casuals also don't bother to go outside their comfort zone. They don't even try to read at least one book. It's not hard to get a list of the best Star Wars books one could start with, but filthy casuals are too lazy to do that. Another trait that filthy casuals have is that they're easily swayed by mainstream people who are also filthy casuals but pretend to be experts. And since the filthy casual listening to the famous filthy casual doesn't know any better, they'll sit down, shut up, and listen to whatever they say. And that brings me to the subgroup I define as Filoni groupies. If you're at least somewhat educated on Star Wars, you'll know who Dave Filoni is, and the buzz around him. Expanded Universe fans despise him, but more casual fans who haven't read squat are more easily to be swayed by Dave Filoni's work in the Star Wars franchise. And since they don't know any better, and they don't care to know better, they stick to whatever he makes and call him the savior of Star Wars. Now, what is a definition without examples? And I wanted to give some out. The most basic filthy casual I can think of is Red Letter Media. These guys were in a position to be the worst Star Wars critics ever. Mike Stalaska, if that's how you say his name, first and foremost, is more of a Trekkie, and Star Trek nerds are usually terrible at critiquing Star Wars right off the bat. His only range on top of that, especially when he was writing the prequel reviews, were the 6 Star Wars movies of the time and nothing else. No Thrawn trilogy, no Dark Forces, nothing. There's nothing. Just nothing. It was just the movies. And that isn't bad by default for a film channel, but the thing is, Mike clearly watched the behind-the-scenes documentaries that would give him more context than the films themselves, and he actively chose to spin them out of context and make George Lucas look bad. On top of being dishonest, he was not very qualified to talk about Star Wars in detail, and really did not know what he was talking about. Now I wanted to talk about a bare maximum filthy casual, and these can be any baseline Star Wars channel, but the one I'm going to pick is Turf Nation. Now this guy, from what I've seen, is only one step ahead of Plinkett when it comes to range, and that's because he watched all the movies, watched the modern shows from the Clone Wars onwards, and played at least some of the games. But from what I've seen, it's mostly the modern ones, like EA Battlefront and Jedi Fallen Order and Survivor. Still, he's not anywhere close to being past the 1% completion mark, which is a problem, because he talks about Star Wars in an incredibly rigid way. To him, the only shit that exists is the movies, the modern shows, fuck anything like the micro series and before, and the more modern games. But anyone who watches me knows that's far from the end of the list. I don't think Turf Nation has the proper perspective to see that the shit that Disney makes is terrible, whether it being woke matters or not. I don't think Turf understands under his guise of respect other people's opinions and all Star Wars is good blah blah, is that Disney does not share that mentality. I don't know why I have to say this, because it's incredibly obvious, but a lot of the shit they make don't respect a lot of the prior source material. Look at The Force Awakens, for example. They went out of their way to shit on and ignore the prequels, and this becomes even more obvious when they look at how they marketed The Force Awakens. J.J. Abrams and crew were out there being like, whoa, we're going back to stock camera, and we're going back to practical effects, and blah 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 blah. What do you think they were going back from? The prequels, of course. And they didn't seem to acknowledge that The Phantom Menace, for example, had more practical sets than the entire original trilogy combined. They did not even try to hold all Star Wars as sacred. It was just a shallow pivot to prequel haters who wanted nothing to do with the prequels, and instead of seeing all Star Wars as valuable, they folded like a chair and shit on half of the Star Wars saga. It was weird that they were calling it Episode 7 even. They should have just thrown the prequels out and called The Force Awakens Episode 4. That's how little respect they had. And if Turf was even remotely familiar with the expanded universe, he'd know that Disney went out of their way to subconsciously disregard and invalidate the expanded universe. Like, can someone show Turf Nation the tweets from someone like Pablo Hidalgo and his disrespectful comments towards EU fans? You're not gonna still use the all Star Wars is good argument to defend Disney specifically, right? I think Turf just goes for the simplistic stance of all Star Wars is good to defend Disney when Disney does not share your mentality. And in fact, they have the opposite mentality, because they've shit on the prequels numerous times, ignored them, jabbed at them so many times, along with the expanded universe, in which they discontinued it, lied that it was never canon, refused to publish any more of it, save for the Old Republic MMO and a one-off comic, and have their employees constantly shit on it, like Pablo Hidalgo, and more sneakishly Dave Filoni. Like, Filoni in particular is only pretending to listen to Expanded Universe fans, and EU fans can see right through his facade. But filthy casuals like Turf would say something like, Filoni's giving you heir to the Empire, why aren't you happy? Because that's clearly not what EU fans meant. On top of the fact that the adaptation of Thrawn they churned out is piss poor. And what do you know? Turf Nation liked Thrawn in Ahsoka.
And Thrawn himself is very well done. His introduction is fantastic. We learn a lot about who he is and how strategic and intelligent he is. And maybe my Danish bias will show here, but Lars Mikkelsen is a freaking goat. And anyone who says that he doesn't fit live-action Thrawn should fucking be proud of their opinions, because after all, people, they are just opinions.
Like, there's a reason this Spider-Man No Way Home meme I used a while ago used Turf Nation and Palpa memes. Because I wouldn't be surprised if I had a conversation with them and I talked about Jura Sabaoth and Talon Card and the Yislamari, and he'd obviously be like, what the hell is a Juras Kabath? But there's a filthy casual that's worse than both of the previous examples, and that, my friends, is Cosmotard Variety Hour. This guy has the distinction of pretending to be an expert, but is actually a filthy casual pretending to be credible. In any of his Star Wars videos, he references how he's this hardcore Star Wars nerd.
I love Star Wars books, games, movies, shows. Even if you don't know how strong they are from a fucking book or a video game like I am.
And then he proceeds to express his ignorance and proves that he ain't read squat. One of the most annoying examples is when he tries to say that people can use the Force without training, which is something no Expanded Universe fan would say, because the opposite was emphasized a lot in the books. One personal example I cited in the Darth Bane trilogy is when the titular character learns he is Force sensitive, and that, quote, it is nothing without training. So Cosmotard is just flat out wrong. Something more specific he says is when he tries listing off reasons Luke is a Mary Sue, despite previously criticizing Rebels for having Sabine be a Mary Sue.
Without ever having used the turret on the Millennium Falcon, he's able to defeat a squadron of trained TIE fighter pilots.
I love how he puts the emphasis on the word train, and it demonstrates how lore illiterate he is. TIE fighter pilots, and by extension stormtroopers, had minimalist training and were outfitted with poor equipment. Like the TIE fighter in particular had no shields, and were cheaply made and were dispensable to the Empire, along with their pilots. That's why they were easily destroyable. The Empire relied on quantity over quality for their militarization. Any real expert would know this and be furious at Cosmotard's ignorance. And Cosmotard, being a self-proclaimed die-hard Star Wars nerd, proves on a constant basis that he doesn't know anything beyond the filthy casual range. The one time I recall him knowing anything from the books is when he used James Luceno's Tarkin novel to defend hyperspace ramming. He doesn't provide any context, and it's only one passage though. So I think he easily could have gotten it off Wikipedia or someone citing it on Reddit or whatever. But the thing is, he doesn't really talk about Tarkin besides that one bit. Also, only a filthy casual would say Star Wars should be simple, because that proves that you haven't even gone outside the filthy casual's comfort zone. It's highly unlikely that you even played KOTOR 2, and if you did, you definitely hated it because it was too complex for your simple casual ass. So those are my 3 examples. Filthy casuals come in all shapes and sizes, and they can have different ranges from each other, but the maximum they have is always minimalistic. They couldn't read the Thrawn trilogy to save their lives, and the thing is, most of their perspectives on Star Wars would change if they actually went out on an active effort to read the expanded universe. Anyone who says that Star Wars was dead or dying after 2005, answer this question for me. Why did The Force Unleashed or Battlefront 2 sell as well as it did if nobody gave 2 fucks about Star Wars anymore as a dead brand? The first one coming out 3 years after Revenge of the Sith, and the second coming out the same year as Revenge of the Sith. This Star Wars fatigue was in fact total nonsense. Any actual invested Star Wars fan who didn't like the prequels would just say, oh okay, that sucked, and then move on to the next thing, like The Force Unleashed, or The Clone Wars, or whatever at the very least. So I think I've clearly defined what a filthy casual is, and the biggest examples on why they're so filthy. But one last disclaimer, you can also have an incredible range and still be a complete idiot. And that brings me to Star Wars Explained, one of the biggest Disney Star Wars shills that, despite the fact that he should know better, as he followed both the EU and Disney canon alike, would propagate Disney Star Wars above all else. He's what we'd call a sellout. His approach is to completely sell his honesty and side with the white slavers so he can get free gifts from Mickey Mouse, as well as easy interviews with the authors and supporting actors or whatever. It's cheap, but that's who he decided to be. I have no doubt that he's read Heir to the Empire and the Darth Bane trilogy and obscure comics from the 80s and 90s, but he sold his soul to the mouse, and that's what makes him unreliable, despite not being a filthy casual. I try to increase my range, as well as keep up to date on my perspective on Star Wars, and anyone who watches my earlier videos should see that. I used to think that Dave Filoni was cool, and now I fucking hate his guts. And that's due to widening my range on Star Wars. I looked at more than just what he made. I also looked at what could be considered the original Clone Wars and whatnot. I imagine my perspective will change ever still, so don't expect me to have the exact same opinion in 2 years from now. With that being said, however, I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories about mystery boxes?
Under the mountain, a golden fountain. Were you praying that the Loris struck?